Joining us now to discuss voter conduct and the issues that shape the character of the U.S. voting patterns is, of course, we are going to be joined by Professor Christopher Isike later on, but we've got Jamie Mighti, who's an independent analyst on the line with us. And certainly, Jamie, it's good to have you with us tonight. You look at what has been happening in the past hour or so. We saw, Pennsylvania there. We saw Joe Biden being in the lead, certainly a dramatic turn of events. And then now Georgia is recounting. It certainly tells us there's a lot at stake here.
There's definitely a lot at stake, and you can see that both sides are very invested in the process. And I'm talking here, besides the politicians, the actual voters themselves, because even though Trump is very behind in the popular vote by about 3.5 million, his base is still a very sizable base. And if there is any whiff of partiality, of bias, or impropriety, which they are actually trying to fan the flames of, that could lead to a lot of problems after the fact. Because in order to govern effectively, you do need to have the legitimacy and acceptance of all of the citizens and not half or close to half of the citizens. And this is a challenge that is making the process a bit slower than usual. Normally, you would have had a lot of these races called, but because of the tension, because of the narrowness in these swing states, and because in some spaces there is a legal space for you to make this recount request, it's important that it's done properly so that there is a space to govern. The challenge here is, of course, that the Democrats have lost some seats in Congress, and that even if they do win both seats in Georgia, they barely have a Senate that can pass the kind of big legislation that they would need to. And that is the challenge that is going ahead. And so because that challenge exists, everyone is being super delicate about making sure that everything is above board. Because if Trump does find something which is irregular and that he can latch onto, that can become the narrative up until the midterm elections.
Now, Jamie, we've been talking here in studio about the American tradition of candidates conceding defeat. But if you're looking at how things are playing out in the United States, it doesn't look like Donald Trump will be doing that. What does this mean for the American dream that we've been sold for years? And also, what does it mean for the American democracy?
Well, it does mean that American democracy is in a state of some form of dysfunction. That's the first answer to that particular question. But I think we've always known that Donald Trump got rid of political decorum because he realized that there was a large cohort of Americans who would still support an individual regardless of the gravitas and the dignitas and the decorum which has existed in American politics for a while. So he almost pulled the curtain and exposed what many of us suspected, in that there is a lot of bigotry, there is a lot of difference of opinion on issues of culture, on issues of race, and issues of class. And moving forward, we're going to see a continuation of these contestations. It's very clear that many in the states where Trump is dominating, these red states, feel as if they are not included in the economic gains which are happening in the big cities. And also, they don't agree with the cultural direction which is being taken. Part of that is based on identity. Part of that is based on norms. Some of them feel as if the America that they lived and grew up in is being erased by people living in Silicon Valley and New York, and they're pushing back against that. And they found a champion in Donald Trump. And that's why you find that there's been a rise in this community of right-wing commentariat, right-wing podcasters, right-wing YouTubers who have also been flaming these flames of cultural and racial division. Now, in terms of to pass major policy, you need to have more than 50% social support. You need to have more than just the fine line of support for an issue. Otherwise, you find yourself in the kind of contestations that we're seeing in the United Kingdom with Brexit. And I think this is where America is going to go. And the challenge is going to be the signature reforms that many people are waiting for, whether it's police reform, whether it's student loans, whether it's rent controls, whether it's breaking up the big tech companies. These laws require bipartisan support, and they require a large public support. but if they become politicized in the way that everything else has, the reforms that are necessary to actually improve the lives of American people are not going to be seen on the ground. And that is the real concern, I think, that exists beyond the politics of personality, is that the dysfunction is so bad that it will be unlikely that any major legislation is going to be passed. And this could create a lame duck presidency for Joe Biden, where all he can do is signpost the cultural issues, signpost the racial issues, but not actually be able to pass anything of significance in order to change them. And after a while, that emotional high that everyone is feeling now will fade away, and the police will still be shooting black bodies. The institutions will still exist in exclusionary patterns, and that is really going to create a frustration and maybe a shift further left down the stream.
And Jamie, when you look at, the Americans and the voters that are voting for President Donald Trump that you just described right now, would you say that that is why it has been easy for the Make America Great Again rhetoric to find space within?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I would agree with you. But I think there's some other numbers that also should be worrying the Democrats, even as they are celebrating. You know, sometimes celebration, you can get carried away. The number of Latino community people who voted for Donald Trump is a red flag that they ought to be worried about. But also the black vote for Donald Trump was surprisingly high, showing that some people within the black community no longer feel as if that is their best home for their political needs and their community needs. And if Donald Trump doesn't go away, which I suspect he will not, because he will feel like he has to keep fighting, because some of the things that are chasing him in terms of the money he owes and maybe even prosecutions may put him in fight mode even beyond the election. Those things indicate that the divisions in America are very deep, and the Democratic Party will have to do some real introspection. And they may have to start listening to people like Bernie Sanders and AOC, who have been trying to tell them that this middle-of-the-road approach is one that is not going to appeal to the majority of Americans. When you look at the issue votes, most people supported the progressive issues, which even Joe Biden was afraid to endorse. So it shows that people are willing to consider universal health care. People are willing to consider, rent controls. But now Joe Biden, in order to get those people back and to accept his presidency, he's going to have to try to chase those issues and try to get those people back, because those trends are alarming. And I would be very worried if I was Joe Biden, because I'm looking at communities that I thought should be my natural home, and they are rejecting me.
Keep fighting. It looks like Donald Trump will be, and given the number of lawsuits that we've seen in various states. Now, some people are saying that Trump here is abusing the courts, but by the same token, it is his democratic right to approach the courts. What do you make of his lawsuits that he has filed in the various states?
Well, I think there was always an anticipation that Donald Trump is a sore loser in the first instance. So part of this is just personality. But I think we ought to be very careful to not allow people to follow the process if they are concerned. I mean, I have seen some troubling reports here and there of irregular activity, which I do think needs to be ventilated properly in order for everyone to be comfortable. I think that if people are dismissive, if people have been making the requests as they have been saying to the right, show us the evidence, show us the proof. And in some instances, people are saying, well, I'm not allowed to look at the ballots. I'm too far away. I have to use the binoculars. Some of it is COVID-19, but some of it actually does start to raise the questions which I think need to be adequately ventilated. And if someone is exercising their democratic rights within the rules and regulations of the process, I think it's better to have an election that is beyond reproach and a result that is beyond reproach. Otherwise, you start stepping into African political tendencies where some of the tough questions were never resolved and some of the tough answers were never found. And in a very volatile economic environment, that can be really bad. I think we must remember that in America, a lot of people just have guns in their yards and they have guns in their basements. And the potential for violence is even more than in Africa, where only the state has guns and where the civilians are generally disarmed. So if there's a feeling of dissatisfaction in a large number of those people who are pro-Trump, that can actually lead to high risks for stability downstream, and that's undesirable. So there's a social element that's important for this to be pursued, but also the legal element does allow him. And if we believe in democracy, let's count every vote. Let's make sure everything is beyond reproach, and let's make sure that the outcome is one that at least gives the winner enough room to breathe in terms of them not having to deal with whether they won or they lost. I think that's something that we have to be very disciplined about in terms of messaging. Let him follow every process that's required, and let's get to the bottom of every result. I think it's very clear, though, that even with every contestation, it's most likely still going to be a Biden victory, because he needs more than one legal outcome to work in his favor, and the math is not in his favor. But due process must be followed. Nobody must be in a hurry. This is a very high-stakes election.
Now, Jamie, you must be careful there when you're talking about African political tendencies, because now those tendencies are actually global. Now, another issue here is that given the gap between Trump and Biden, now talking about the popular votes, we've seen a similar pattern in 2016, and all of this brings into question the relevance of the electoral college system, whether it is still relevant today or whether America should actually consider, given the fact that it was a system that was introduced many years ago, hundreds of years ago, when we did not have the technology that we have now. Perhaps is it not time that they relook their electoral system?
Well, I'm going to give you a slightly different opinion to the one many people would say, is that, we use the popular vote in democracy because it's the only thing that we have. But sometimes you do have a situation where you have a tyranny of the majority, and where the majority starts to bully you into things that are undemocratic for you. So having said that, even Socrates was a bit concerned about democracy, and he wasn't a fan of it. Having said that, I think it's important for us to remember that this was put in place as a check for avoiding situations where a conservative community ends up being forced to live in a way that New York wants to live. I think if I live in the South and I have certain values that I want to preserve, I should be able to contest for those values within my state and not have federal imposition. Because what you're beginning to see is that there are some cities which have a groupthink. You've got New York, you've got the West Coast, Oregon, you've got California, and they have a certain value system which is not necessarily the value system of Arizona. And we have to be really careful in just thinking about the management of a population of 300 million people. Is what happens if the guy in South Dakota feels as if America no longer represents him and South Dakota must become independent? And what happens if that spreads to Texas and another state? And I think while it's very true that there is an undemocratic element of the Electoral College, there's also an element of it which does allow those states some level of autonomy. And I would say I'm leaning towards keeping it the same, but finding ways to make it more representative so that, for instance, the smaller states don't have a disproportionate amount of sway in the decision making. I think when you have Nevada being so important as compared to some of the bigger states, it then becomes a bit irregular. But the likelihood of it being fixed in a divided House and a divided Senate is unlikely. I think it's going to remain a feature of American politics for a while.
All right. Thank you so much for your time tonight. That's independent analyst Jamie Mighti there.